Morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Banyan webinar entitled Zero Trust Security for DevOps and Cloud. I'm joined today by Carlos Martinez, our Director of Solutions Architecture, and Matt Schiller, Senior Software Engineer. And what we're really looking at doing is sort of a hands-on workshop in which we help organizations migrate infrastructure to the cloud and rethink software development and deployment using zero trust as an approach. Today, I'm going to just go ahead and pass it over to Carlos and Matt, and they can introduce themselves. This will take about an hour. And yes, this will be recorded for your viewing pleasure later, and we'll pass on these materials to you throughout the session. And plus, you're all welcome to ask questions throughout. So we're here to help and take you on your zero trust journey. So with that, I'm just going to pass it over to Carlos and Matt.
Great, thank you, Joe. Again, Carlos Martinez, part of the team responsible for solutions architecture here at Banyan. I joined Banyan, a little bit about my background here is I joined Banyan Security back in December of 2021. So I think I'm close to 6 months tenure. But prior to Banyan, I was part of the team responsible for kicking off the Zero Trust initiatives at Adobe and most recently at Cisco. So yeah, hoping to share, and I can speak to firsthand just some of the benefits that we're going to be speaking on today. Matt?
And then my name is Matt Schiller, and I'm the senior software engineer here at Banyan, and I'm the principal developer behind our Terraform provider. And a little bit of my background is I was part of the continuous delivery team at Lookout Security, and we went through a FedRAMP implementation, in which Banyan would have been a really good fit. So that is my background, yeah.
Hindsight. Well, there's always the future.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
exactly.
And this is a sort of a stripped down version of a talk you two gave to a developers conference a few months ago. And now we're just sort of doing the high octane version of that, along with sort of diving into how Banyan can help in particular.
That's right, Joe. And let me just go ahead and actually just touch on, again, the agenda. As you pointed out, we're here to talk about the security approach that I'm sure you may have heard of. It's coined as Zero Trust. But really for us, we're going to show how implementing these Zero Trust principles will help enable a more seamless and secure method of access to infrastructure and corporate resources. And as you pointed out, Joe, I'm going to go through a few slides, but really the meat of today's webinar is going to be Matt showing you guys firsthand, demonstrating how you can get started and how you can sort of apply some of these Zero Trust principles firsthand. So I don't know, Matt, I'm hoping the demo gods are with us today. But
yeah, well, I got some we've pre-applied the setup, so we already know it's good to go. So no relying on the demo gods today.
Okay. Let me turn off the candle then. All right, guys. Well, but before we go into just sort of just the benefits of applying Zero Trust principles, what I want to first cover are, what is a traditional method for accessing infrastructure or resources look like today? And specifically, how DevOps or engineers, folks access some of these resources that are located in a private network. And in this example, we can say it can be a database or Kubernetes cluster. Well, there's typically a variety of components that exist today between the user and that target system hosted in that private network. And that private network can be a VPC, an on-prem data center, whatever the case may be. You would typically deploy some systems on the edge of your network, and that could be a VPN solution or SSH bastion host, which essentially joins the user to the network, again, in order to gain access to that resource. Now, typically, to ensure you're not granting someone full access to all the resources on the network, you'd have some sort of a firewall, or in this case, a set of security group or groups to limit or restrict access from that VPN or bastion host to that target resource. Now, in order for users to gain access, that end-to-end access to that resource, users need some information, right? Some access, and that consists of, credentials. So in the case of that VPN concentrator or system, you need to know where to connect to and have that set of credentials to initiate that VPN connection. Next is, similarly, you need those keys or credentials to gain access to that bastion host. And then last is what about that downstream service or application? Now, those are some of the things. Similarly, or on the flip side, administrators need to manage all of that. So in the case of VPN access, ensuring that certain users, based on their roles or job function, are they added or set to defined to certain set of groups? What about handling those keys that are issued to your users, that rotation of keys, et cetera? Things like firewall rules and making sure that you only allow that necessary access to subnets. And then let's not forget that downstream service or application, ensuring that service owners are providing users with the necessary set of credentials for those systems. So there's quite a bit, both from a user and administrator standpoint, that need to be considered. And there's a lot of challenges with this traditional approach. We've listed here a few of those challenges, but one challenge is really around that whole workflow for offboarding and onboarding users. As an administrator, I don't want to have to manage VPN or SSH keys for people who join or leave the company. That things like key rotation, it can be a total burden, especially when an organization is rapidly growing or a large enterprise has to deal with the constant stream of exiting employees. Another challenge is around utilizing these old network-centric approaches for restricting access based solely on static IP or host information. Now, the reality today is that you're likely dealing with a highly ephemeral or dynamic environment where there's a need to restrict access to specific logical services based on the role of the user. And then the last piece that we call out here is as you provide certain credentials directly to a user, what happens in that scenario if that set of credentials becomes compromised? And ideally, you don't want to be in that position where you're providing certain system credentials to users. So those are some of the challenges. But again, the reality is that these problems are greatly compounded when you're deploying and managing services across different cloud networks or cloud accounts, compartments, or even in a multi-cloud architecture where you're utilizing different cloud providers. The reality is ideally you want to move towards a zero trust security model. And yes, we've seen, and you probably have not been able to escape the marketing buzz or the machine when it comes to zero trust, right? But the reality is that the fundamentals are sound, which is all about removing that inherent trust that's granted when you join a particular network. Now, a zero trust architecture has its variety of benefits. And again, we call out a few here and we try to keep them as generic as possible because they really do apply to the different zero trust network access or ZTNA solutions out there. But one of the benefits comes around the user experience. With a zero trust network access or ZTNA model, users are able to move away from having to know the varying credentials that they were previously given and instead move towards a user performing a single sign-on. And this helps ensure that, we're getting a strong assertion of the user by requiring things like MFA, not just the set of credentials. And in the case of Banyan, we do this, again, like other solutions, by integrating with your existing identity provider. Additionally, many zero trust network access or ZTNA solutions like Banyan will also typically offer a lightweight app that can be installed on a user's computer. This app or lightweight agent will typically serve as a catalog that allows users to see quickly what services or resources they have access to. It also enables the ability for us for a user to leverage their existing tools or command line that they're already familiar with. Now let's talk a little bit about the security benefits. So from a security perspective, this lightweight app that I just mentioned can also be used to perform device posture checks to determine if a device meets certain security requirements. Things like, are you running the latest security patches? Is disk encryption enabled? And if for whatever reason that device doesn't meet those requirements, well, that application can provide users with self-remediation steps that they can do. Again, upgrading your device to have the latest security patches installed, et cetera. And so with a zero trust environment or architecture, an administrator can define and enforce a specific set of policies or conditions that are required in order to be allowed access to a specific, again, logical service or resource. So these are some of the benefits. As we sort of move now to, before we go into the actual demo, one of the things that we wanted to sort of call out is that when it comes to a ZTNA solution, there's some core concepts that you want to familiarize yourself with. And we'll be using these as we walk through the demo. The first is around roles. So roles are really is how you're able to map a user to a set of permission grants. So as an example, I want to define a role that includes all of my regular workers that are tied to corporate issued devices, as an example. That could be an example of a role. Another could be a vendor. Yeah, I want to define a role that includes all of these contingent workers. The next sort of concept, as I mentioned already, is service catalog. I already touched on some of the capabilities of what a service catalog does. The next piece is the concept or term is policy, which a policy really comes down to defining which roles can access specific services available in that catalog. And then the last piece that I'll call out are workflows. And in our case, there's a variety of workflows to consider, things like publishing that service. The other is, as mentioned earlier, being able to manage those policies or defining those granular contextual-based policies and attaching them to the services. And then the last piece is, as I touched on earlier, is how you integrate that with your SSO solution. So those are some of the core concepts. Again, we'll be touching on that. All right, so let's get into the demo. Before I pass it over to Matt, I just wanted to call out that, the demo you're about to see, we're going to be exclusively be using Terraform to fully deploy all of the network infrastructure and test resources in AWS. We'll also be using a free version of Banyan Zero Trust Network Access solution to really what we're going to be doing is deploying this connector component on the same private subnet as the test resources, which allow that end-to-end connectivity from a user to a resource. This is one method of deploying access or deploying a ZTNA solution where you have a connector that dials out to that set of proxy infrastructure. In this case, it's managed or hosted by Banyan. But similarly, you can deploy that entire proxy infrastructure in your environment, eliminating the need for a user to traverse that global edge network. So there's a variety of options here. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Matt, for you to kind of demo the experience. So let me stop sharing.
All right, sure. Thank you, Carlos. One second, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so we're gonna walk kind of through like a live code setup so that we can see some of this in action, and we'll walk through how you can, go to GitHub, see which demonstration may be more relevant to you depending on what your cloud provider is. And for this demonstration, we're going to be using AWS, and we'll upload a new repo to our Banyan GitHub, which has this webinar code in it. So Terraform is a really great tool for something, any type. It's really become the de facto for infrastructure automation in the industry, and the crux of what's the difficulty between a VPN and a zero trust solution is the definition of services, right? And that allows you to create that granular access model to the different services that you're publishing into your zero trust solution, in this case, Banyan. So with Banyan, each service that you have in your infrastructure is published with a policy which defines who has access to that service and that device posture that Carlos was talking about. And when you are setting this up, any of these demonstrations can be done with the Banyan Team Edition. So you just go to sign up for the Banyan Team Edition, and when you log in, the first thing that you'll be brought into is the onboarding section. And in here, all we're going to need to do is get an admin API key so that we can deploy infrastructure automated with Terraform. So we just exit out of here and then go into our API keys, and we'll just create a new one for the admin. You can see I've already created an admin API key here. So once we have that API key, that's going to allow us to authenticate as the admin to the Banyan control plane, and that will make it so that you can initialize the Terraform provider. So every different resource in the Banyan API is available in the Banyan provider. And if you go to the Terraform registry and search for Banyan, you can see the documentation which has how you would implement each of the different pieces. So in this demonstration or this walkthrough repo, I'm going to be showing you how all these pieces come together with Terraform, and how Terraform is extremely, basically the perfect tool for automating the deployment of resources, right? Because when we're talking about a DevOps environment, it really comes down to, DevOps, you don't have like a DevOps person. DevOps is a practice that's within your organization. So the responsibility falls to different teams to do different things, right? We have people that are network practitioners, we have people that are security practitioners, and then we have our service owners, right? And for me, as like an infrastructure person, it's all about abstracting away the complexity of infrastructure with a tool like Terraform, so that my service owners can consume something which, the security organization or the network organization has said, this is how we want this to be implemented. So for example, in this demonstration, what we're going to be doing is just setting up, there's a fair amount of boilerplate here, just with, or how this is divided up really is that we have this app instance file, which is all this is just deploying a demonstration site that's on an instance. And then we have our Banyan file, which we're going to go through this in this demonstration, explain what each of these pieces are. And then we have this connector module, and the connector module is what's actually providing the connection into our private environment. So when we go through, when we have this this setup, we are creating a private. The first thing that this module is going and doing is creating a private subnet. Okay, and once we're in that private subnet, we're just going to drop in the Banyan connector. And I wish I had a slide for this, Carlos, but maybe if you could shoot me over the diagram of what we have.
Yeah, I can show it as well if you want me to kind of show. But yeah, let me fire.
Yeah, maybe some of your slide could be awesome. But anyways, So what we'll just go in, I'll just apply this really fast just to show that this has already been applied so that we don't have to wait for like the instance to come up or anything. Okay, and this is going through and it's doing multiple layers really, but what the layers are is that private subnet, then we're dropping in the Banyan connector. And the Banyan connector is an easy way for people that are trying to, try out Banyan to get access into their private network. So in a zero trust solution, instead of a VPN gateway that you end up hitting, you're actually going directly to like proxy on steroids would be the best way to put it. This is what we call our access tier. And there's two types of access tiers that Banyan offers. There's the self-managed access tier, which you would deploy into your network and give a public IP address with a public DNS record, so that users are going directly to that access tier and getting authenticated, getting their device posture evaluated, and then based off of that context are allowed or not allowed access to services. So there is no tunnel. And that's all fine, but there's also the case where, well, maybe I don't want to go set up a whole, a DNS record for this so far. So what we've done is made it so that there's a connector, and the connector, what it does is that it makes it so that we have our managed access tier, which we call the global edge, and it will create a tunnel into this connector, which you deploy inside your private network. So there needs no public IP address needs to be shown, and we can deploy that connector with just as easy as this, which is in the repository, where we just bring in the Banyan connector module, we get the subnet, the VPC, we give it a name, an instance size, and the API key to host the region, just the basic amount of stuff that we need to go to deploy this connector. And what this will do is go and create the connector instance and connect it into the global edge under the context of your organization. So what that leaves us is with, let me see if I got thank you, Carlos. Perfect. Okay, let me bring this up. No, 1 second. Hold on.
And Matt, while you're bringing that up, I'll just reiterate the point of the different options, and we see a lot of folks that will prefer deploying their own proxy infrastructure. It gives them that ability to deploy. Oh, you've got it up here. Okay, perfect.
Yes. So there's that the global edge, which we host, and then there's the access tier, which the customer hosts, and that eliminates this tunnels at all. So that is, the ideal production setup, but you also end up having, edge cases, like maybe I just want to throw up a private subnet somewhere else, and I don't want to have to deal with, deploying a new access tier and doing a new public DNS record. So we really leave that up to the customer, and that's one of the things that's nice about the provider is that, you get all the different components and can match them together in the ways that fit how your organization works. So in this demonstration, we basically just deployed a connector inside of our private network, which we just created as well. And what we've also done is deployed an instance. And this instance just shows a demonstration website, which will show us what that instance private IP address is. But what's awesome about this is you see, like, when you deploy an instance in AWS using a Terraform, unless you're going and saying, oh, this is, you're reserving IP addresses for everything, which is typically not what people are doing, you're getting generated some type of endpoint. So, like, for example, if I deploy something in Kubernetes and I wanted to expose it through Banyan, I could do a private load balancer, and then the idea of that load balancer or the address of that load balancer, Amazon is just going to give me, right? So that would be like some other step that I would have to go and do to be able to publish a service for that matches to that internal address. So what Terraform allows us to do is to create services dynamically based off of how the service was created within Amazon. So when we go and we create that application instance, that's our demonstration service, we're just telling AWS to go and create an instance. And when it creates that instance, then we have these other attributes which are being exposed, like the private IP address. So when we're using Banyan, what we're able to do is define a web service and an SSH service that are using the backend domain, or like the backend of address that's being produced by that instance being raised up, right? So when AWS created that instance, then the instance was assigned a private IP that nobody knew about until AWS created it. And Terraform is able to inject that into a new service within Banyan that uses the private IP of that service. So and then what we're doing is that, let's just go through each of these. We have the connector. So we're saying, okay, this service is accessible behind that connector that we deployed. So now it knows that Banyan's command center knows that when a user wants to access that service, that it's going to have to be behind the connector that we created. And then we give that an address. So this is the address that is going to be public facing for that service. We give it the backend domain, which we're just feeding the AWS instance's private IP, and we're giving it the port. And in this case, because this is just a small demonstration service, we don't have TLS enabled, but Banyan is able to wrap this entire connection in TLS with your Banyan short-lived certificate. So that's really important to something like a DevOps environment, because typically when people are doing a DevOps model, they're rapidly deploying, that continuous delivery, continuous integration. And when your development environment, before you had the advent of zero trust, you either had to have a very, very locked down, very strict security setup, which in many organizations tends to be 2 different VPNs, right? You have one for development and you have one for production. And Banyan allows you to have one plane of access, which is going to be the end user's Banyan application, which looks like this. And all of these different services can be hosted in different places in all of your different, it could be, you can have on-premise stuff, you can have edge stuff, you could literally run the connector or an access tier on a Raspberry Pi in your office if you wanted to. It allows you extreme amounts of flexibility and isolation between your different networks. So I can be, even though this is one plane of access, the Banyan application, I can be publishing apps that have no connection to each other whatsoever. So my development environment, I can be publishing services that it is not possible for them to go into another network. That route does not exist, right? And those different services are being published to your end users, and they just access them, without you having to know the implementation, right? So, so in this setup, we're just doing very basic. We're just making a web policy which allows everyone that has a high trust level, and we have a infrastructure policy which allows everyone with a high trust level. And what that's saying is that the end user's device needs to be encrypted and updated, and needs to be a trusted device, right? So I wouldn't be able to just go do this on like some random cell phone or whatever, even though I was logged into my account. This actually needs to be able to trust my device before I get into any of these services. So this demonstration service, and what's great about this is that all you need to know to set this demonstration up is just, give us a VPC, give it a VPC and an NAT gateway and your the subnet that you're using in your organization API key, and this will go and deploy a private subnet to show you, hey, we went from, nothing, private subnet, no access whatsoever, to dropping in a connector, then dropping in a service. And we actually have access to that service through the Banyan app. So we can see that, we've named this the live demo. And in the Banyan, when we applied it, it went in, created all of the different pieces. So the instance, the connector, the policies that were applied to it. And then my end user will see that live demonstration website, right? And I can open that up. And then that website, and I mean, you can see how blazing insanely fast that is too, which is definitely, when you go zero trust, one of the benefits. And all this demonstration site does is just shows us, what's the IP address of that instance. And we can see, this is a private address. And if we go into, AWS console, you would be able to see that there is no public access, no public IP address for this server. So the only way to get to this server right now is to go through the connector, which is connected to our global edge, and you're authenticated into that server. And even though this server did not have SSL enabled, Banyan is going to wrap that in a TLS connection with a short-lived certificate and give you access to that service. So, okay, there's a fair amount of pieces there. There's a lot to unpack. And how do we leverage this in a DevOps environment where everyone is, deploying their own services, right? Like me as the infrastructure practitioner, I want people to be able to deploy services within the context of a model that I've created. So we have a bit of a reorganization of this demonstration, which I'm calling the modular demo. And let me open this one up really fast. Hold on, sorry. Okay, so now what we're able to do here is that we've taken all of the Banyan pieces that we had written. So we have the web service, the SSH service, in the policy attachments, right? So we, in the first repo, we went and created a network, we created policies, we deployed the connector, and all those are kind of, those are one-time things, right? So typically that would go live in an infrastructure repo, which is controlled by your networking infrastructure team, or whichever team is, responsible for kind of laying the groundwork, right? And what they do, what's something that's really powerful about Terraform is this idea of modularization. So what we can do is we can package up the web service in the SSH service and the policy attachment for each, and just create a module for that, which will only expose a couple of variables to the end user. And most of them we can actually populate with some type of defaults, right? So we need the connector security group, so that will allow the internal firewall in AWS. It will allow whatever service is going to consume this module. It will be able to talk to the connector and whatever else we've defined in that service. But very important that the connector is open to whatever service on the firewall side, because obviously then you would not have a network connection. And then we give it the connector name, and we can populate that with some type of defaults, or in a typical setup, you would say like, okay, this access tier is dev, this access tier is staging, this access tier is production, or maybe connector, whichever piece that you're leveraging for the connection, you give it some type of name which describes, typically it would be like the subnet or the VPC that that component is, that connector or access tier is allowing access to. And then we have the org and the API key and the host. And normally what you would do is you would have some type of like a Jenkins job or a Terraform enterprise, or any, whatever your CI system is, you would inject these variables for the user. So like the end user, and blissfully unaware of all of these variables, with the exception of the service name and the backend domain name, right? So what that does is, what we can do is that we publish this module into our internal GitHub or a module registry that we have for Terraform. And we can have our service owners leverage leverage this module in which we have basically created the context, right? So we say, when you deploy a service into dev, use the module which we provided for dev, or use the module that we provided for staging or production. And we can gradually increase the security between those different environments, right? So if I have a module for dev, I could be referencing a less secure posture than I needed for production, for example. Like in a lot of places, a lot of shops, a typical example of this is that I want to enable SSH access for service owners in development and staging, but this is not something that I want in production. That's something that we see a lot. Or maybe in production, you want to have the production group be, some more secure group. So sometimes people do an access elevation into a type of group where, some approval is required to add the user temporarily to a group which has SSH access to servers in production, but only the ones that user is a team member for, right? So that whole setup can be determined by your policies, and your policies are written as infrastructure as code, right? So I can have the two that we're using here are very, very open, very easy, but we can lock this down more and more depending on the environment. So maybe I want to have one for dev, maybe I want to have one for production, and those be completely different groups in postures than I would need for, development, for example. And that way the user isn't having to go to, one VPN for dev and one VPN for production. And we're not just exposing, our environment like a big network slice as you would with a typical VPN. So when a user goes when a service owner is publishing their service, they'll usually, what will be happening is, these days, is that the service owners are leveraging some of their own infrastructure with Terraform, like they needed to spin up a database or they needed to spin up some security groups. And then the actual application, which they could be deploying, through Kubernetes, or they could be an actual virtual machine. It could also be, a proprietary service, right, to like AWS or GCP, whichever it may be. They're leveraging that with Terraform to implement it. And now that we've created a module which has the web service and the SSH service and the posture that we want predefined, we can then give the user a very, very easy module implementation here like this, where it just says module Banyan, backend domain, service domain, super, super easy. So if they include this one file that has the module which you've predefined, then they can have their zero trust network access like dynamically provisioned as they create the service, right? So in this example, we're just doing the same exact thing, where we're just setting, all this does is create that demonstration instance that shows the private IP address, and that they're just going to feed the Banyan module, which our networking or our infrastructure people have created and determined, this is the posture we want. And all they need to do is just provide it. What is the backend domain? So like the backend address inside of AWS, and what is the service name, right? And so when we go and we do an apply for this, this will go and it will I've pre-applied this, but it goes and it creates a new instance, and it uses the Banyan module, which now we've got down to 2 variables, which is literally just what's the name of what do you want the service to be called, and what's the address of the service. And that will populate the Banyan command center with all of the different infrastructure, which are all the different pieces which are required to publish that service. So you can kind of think this as wrapping your service with Banyan, right? So if I'm the network practitioner and I wanted to add, an additional piece here, all I would need to do is update that module. And then when people rerun their deployment, all of those deployments will be updated. So let's just say I wanted to change the group for some team, or I wanted to change the device trust for some team. And all I need to do is update that in their module. And then when they rerun their deployment, all of that is going to be propagated throughout their entire team or all of their services to update to match what I have provided within that, that team consumed module. So then we can see the same thing here where the modular implementation has been set up, and it's a different IP address than that first one. And this is literally just to represent what a service, but this could be anything, right? If I was deploying anything that's giving you a network endpoint inside of whichever cloud you want that you've deployed a connector into or an access tier, you're going to get whichever private address you're getting, you just feed into the service that you want to publish with Banyan. And like I was saying, you can go into the docs and you can mix and match all these different pieces, right? So we have pieces where you can secure a database, or you can secure your Kubernetes API or your remote desktop instance, SSH, TCP, and allow you to really take the building blocks and match it to how your organization is going to go ahead and deploy a zero trust solution like Banyan. And when we talk a lot about like a zero trust journey, their customers that we have are, they're coming from a VPN, and with the VPN that they were deploying, they were opening up a big slice of their network and they were locking it down with security groups, right? So you have access to the VPN, and basically, with the exception of security groups, you got access for keys to the kingdom, right? So when people, typically the pain point is always comes around publishing services, right? Like, when I had a VPN, if I made a new service, that service I had some access to, but I needed to go find out what the address of that service was when it was deployed, right? So there was still always that piece of like, okay, well, where is the thing, so I can go get to it. And what this approach allows you to do is to not open up your network like that, and to individually publish each service and then have them appear in the end user's catalog, and so that they can access them securely and have all of that stuff like their device posture and their group membership taken into consideration before they're given access to that service. And that we can also do the same thing with SSH. So for example, each of these different services, we have we just do this connect, and then it shows us what the command is going to be. So for me, this would be SSH boot new at live demo. Let's see, what is it? Live demo web. Live demo -SSH. And you can see that I'm SSH'd into that service. So really what
that's powerful, right? I mean, the user, you're abstracting access to that service. The user does not have to know where to VPN to or what bastion host to connect to. I mean, it's all there.
Exactly. And the end user doesn't have to deal with the networking component, right? Because when we come back to DevOps, it's like the shared responsibility, right? Each team is a practitioner of DevOps. It's not just like somebody's the DevOps guy. And before when you do a zero trust setup, you're basically leaving it up to the service owners to correctly configure security groups. Whereas with a zero trust solution, you're adding another layer, which is saying that not only do I want, now just make it so that you have your service has access to the connector, but when you publish a service, you need to implement one of the modules that we've pre-configured to make it so that your service is properly published within the context of the model that we've all agreed on, so that and you can get that down to literally just, you know, 2 variables where it says, okay, each service that's deployed in development gets the development policy for your team, and then there's an SSH in a web service that's configured for it. Or maybe I want to, you know, add another variable to that module where I would just say like, okay, I want, you know, what, like, let's see, what, if we wanted to do like the port, we could say I want the port is going to be like 8443, or whoops. And then in the module, I would just add a new variable that says variable is port, and then type, and then, oops, I messed that up. And then here we would just make it so that it's variable port, and that's how we would be able to expose, you know, more, make it so that the end user could choose their port. So you can decide on the level of flexibility that you want to have for the end user, or, you know, you could have them just go totally custom if you wanted to, you know, introduce them the components and have a preset level or a preset couple of policies that you want your service owners to leverage when they go and they publish a service. So I think that's about the demo right there, Carlos.
No, I mean, you, and I'm going to go ahead and just close. I know we're getting down to the end of our time, but, you know, really just to kind of bring it all back, what Matt, what you presented really was how you enabled access to the resources that you see here in this slide, the VM instances, and in our case, it was some web service, could, you know, SSH server, or some sort of a backend server, could have been a Kubernetes cluster that you're accessing. But what you did essentially, and it took, you were able to do this in a matter of minutes, is you deployed all of the infrastructure, that outbound connector that established, enabled the ability for users to establish an end-to-end connection to that downstream user service. But you were able to require or enforce specific user device-based or user and device-based policies that validates the user. So makes sure that the user is, in fact, you know, who they say they are, and that's through the integration with your identity provider, that whole SSO component, and then verify the device. So is this device tied to the user? Does it meet certain posture requirements? I think you defined a low or high trust policy.
Yeah, we just did the most basic, but basically the blue lines between the connector and the infrastructure piece is what we're trying to expose to our service owners, right? So each team, when they publish their service, we give them a very simple module with a very minimum amount of variables, so that they can just populate it with whatever the address is of that private service, and you know, what the name of it they want it to be. And so that would, you know, take care of, you know, what team they are, you know, what a policy we want them to use, and we really leave it up to, you know, the division between teams to define, like, okay, who, you know, how are we defining the network, how are we defining the policies, and then the service owners are able to leverage that, leverage the publishing of services within the greater context of that model. Yeah.
No, exactly. And so again, folks, if you guys are interested in like following with what Matt shared, the link we have up here, you can access that whole demo repo for you guys to play with. Also, just want to call out that, you know, if you want to learn a little bit more, we have quite a bit of resources that talk about sort of the DevOps use case and some of the workflows. But just like Matt showed, I mean, everything he showed is available for you guys to kick the tires on. So as an example, you guys can get that free version of the Banyan solution. So get that team edition set up with that similar connector configuration. All of that you can set up in, I would say, in the same amount of time it took Matt to kind of get things working. And so I encourage you guys to try out Team Edition. But if you guys also want to spend a little bit more time with some of our engineers or, myself, you can always schedule request a demo where we can go in and talk about your specific sort of use cases and workflows. So again, we wanted to share at a very high level what were some of sort of the benefits in sort of implementing a zero trust network architecture, what you gain from that versus the traditional sort of method, and actually showed you guys how to get it done. So if with that said, I don't know if there's, Joe, if there's anything else you wanted to provide, but this was the last shameless sales slide or marketing slide that I wanted. But other than that, I really don't have anything else. I'm not sure if there's any questions.
I definitely just wanted to point out that we have in our Banyan Security GitHub, we have several different demonstrations. So there's one for GCP, there's one for AWS, and there's one for Azure that walks through this in step by step. So rather than one big thing, you will deploy a network, then you'll deploy the connector, then you'll deploy a service, and highly encourage, if you want to kick the tires on this, to get the Team Edition and then check out whichever repo is relevant to your cloud provider.
With that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thanks to Carlos and to Matt for all your insights and information.
No problem.
Of course, happy to do it.
We're with that, one last shot. And thanks to everybody. And we'll do this again. You guys are going to be on stage at Black Hat. Very exciting. And some other sessions between now and then. But with the hands-on workshop, it's always great to get the product in the hands of people who can see the value and make life better for their teams.
Absolutely. All right.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Joe.
everybody.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye.